This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien begins today's show with his update on the grain market, including futures, cash, exports, long-term pricing, and planting. Chip Redmond, K-State meteorologist, moves the show forward as he recaps the recent severe weather in Kansas and what combination of precipitation and temperatures we can expect. Concluding the show is K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske discussing wild onion and wild garlic. She says what issues they cause for livestock and crop producers. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Daniel, what are we currently seeing in grain markets right now?
Well, not a lot of tremendous movement. We did see on yesterday's market a run up 18, 19 cents for wheat, probably some, I don't doubt, concerns about some cold temperatures being forecast here in the next few days. So that could certainly affect us on the wheat side. Farther out to the west, you can see in the fields, and our agronomists are talking about some wheat that already had been was not in great shape from either dry weather or some freeze issues before. And if this comes along, it'd be really interesting to see where things go in the market. So move today came in, and you did see wheat on the close on Thursday, April the 16th, closed 19 and a quarter cents up in the May contract, May 26, up to 644 and 3/4. Interesting that the July contract is 656 and a half, also up 18 cents. So weather risk, that's where we're at. And when we look at where corn is at, yesterday's close in the May contract down 2 1/4 at 448 and 3/4. Again, hanging around when we don't know what to do, we tend to hang around common numbers, 450 if we don't know what else to do for futures. And for geese corn, the harvest contract 476 and a half. That I'm reminded, I think we were all reminded that when we were looking at these markets about 6 months ago, we were thinking 450, 440 thereabouts. And now as we're into planting, beginning of the planting season, more crop production risk being perceived in different parts of the nation, we're up about a quarter from that. So, and we had been higher, around 490 thereabouts, not that long ago, but still holding up. Some uncertainty that's to be dealt with in the crops yet during the spring and summer. So we'll see. And then November beans, actually unchanged yesterday at 1154 and a half for the November contract. New crop May 1162 and a half. Down 4.5 cents. So not explosive markets right now, other than what happened on wheat in a agricultural and especially an energy market and geopolitical market that has a whole bunch of uncertainty and explosive things that are going on, potentially explosive things that are going on in terms of market movement. So not a lot happening. On the cash side, we have seen the corn market moderate, I guess is a nice fair way to say it. Highest prices recorded in the state were actually there was a bid for 424, 5 cents over in Topeka, higher than that in Pittsburgh, southeast Kansas, down to 439. What traditionally is our bellwether cash market region in the state. Garden City still had pretty good price, even money at $4.19. It's interesting that the eastern third of the state actually is looking as a couple representative bids higher than in the west. For sorghum, highest bid 394 in the Hutchinson area, 374 Topeka, 369 Salina. Other areas holding up decently, but not as well as those others. New crop bids for sorghum about 397, also in Topeka, Hutchinson area 392, 397 in Salina, and 402 in the Colby area. So around $4, and in a lot of cases that compares pretty well with sorghum cost production estimates coming out of K-State. Soybean bids ups and downs depending on where elevator and terminal bids are in a geographic location relative to major exporters and processors, exporting terminals. Highest bid, $11.33 in the Topeka area, and that's not far from a crush plant just south of there. And next highest bid, 11.99, Hutchinson area 11.90, pardon me, 10.99. That's a big difference. 10.99 in the Hutchinson and Salina areas, 10.94 in Pittsburgh area. For wheat, with the run up that we've seen yesterday, the uncertainty, if you're in an area and it isn't damaged already, or maybe damaged further from wheat, this market volatility may give you some new crop forward bid opportunities. So we shall see the highest bids, $6.30 uniformly, all the way across in Topeka, Hutchinson, Salina, and other areas closer to 580, 585, and 579. That'd be in Pittsburgh, Garden City, Colby. So the market speaks. $6.30, given the uncertainty in the market as of this moment. And again, that's up. Well, new crop futures were up for. I'm looking at the July contract up 18, September 16 and a half. So we'll see what happens in terms of the potential weather damage and how much that might move the markets for wheat.
As we continue to look at these markets, looking a little bit more long term, what are you expecting we might be seeing?
Well, we're in the midst of seasonality issues. I think the next USDA data from a long-term view that give us some guidance will come on. I think it's the May 12th WASDE report. In that report, they'll actually give the World Agricultural Outlook Board will give their first 2026-27 forecasts. Traditionally, you'd expect those to be coming in with expectations of normal to very good yields. The acreage numbers that we've just seen that have come out of the prospective plantings report at the end of March will be front and center there. The industry has questions about the corn number, mainly because of the high fertilizer prices that have come about due to a whole host of factors in the world economy and geopolitical energy issues, and you name it. So some questions there. But the USDA numbers that will come out very likely will follow the same higher corn acreage, a little lower soybean acres than we had thought we'd have. And we'll see where the supply and balance sheets go. I don't doubt that the yield trends will match up with those coming out of the USDA Ag Outlook Forum. Again, we have no evidence to the contrary in terms of field conditions or what little is planted, and it's not emerged yet for the most part. And so we're guessing long-term trend yields. So those numbers will come out. They'll be estimating large crops or normal to large crops. So I don't know that will change the market much. In fact, if there's a surprise, it would be that those numbers that come out for soybeans, for corn, for grain sorghum, for wheat, the spring wheat in Durham, that if they weren't anything other than bearish, that would be a surprise, basically. So we'll see where things go. I would say that when you look at the feed grain markets, we still continue to have pretty decent corn exports. For the week ending April the 9th, we had about 61 million bushels shipped, and that's just a bit less than the 68.5 million bushels that are on a weekly basis anticipated that we need to meet this 3.3 billion bushel export goal that the USDA has set, and that's I think the highest we had previously was about 2.7 or 2.8. So a tremendous year export wise for corn, and holding up a decent pace. In fact, we have sales and shipments together about 2.9 billion bushels, and about 87% of the way to this 3.3 billion bushel tremendous record that the USDA is projecting for corn exports. So 87% of the way to the USDA's goal, and we're only about 64% of the way through the marketing year. So very, very positive. Sorghum has been holding up in terms of exports. We had for the week ending April the 9th, we continue to have pretty strong sorghum exports, just a bit over 8 billion bushels, 8 million bushels. That'd also make a difference. 8 million bushels of U.S. sorghum exports. You need a pace of about just a little over 5 to meet the USDA's projection on a weekly basis. So holding up really quite well. I would say for soybeans, weekly pace for April the 9th, last data we have of 30 million bushels at exports actually shipped out of the U.S. We need a pace of about 25.7 with USDA's projection. Of course, we're balancing when the big bulk of all South American beans are going to come onto the market. And who's going to buy them? Is it China or someone else? So that's really more of a, although it looks like a bullish number, there's still question marks around the pace that we'll have. Wheat has had some times in this market year where it's been gone very well, but not so much right now. We hear of international shipments from Russia and other countries going quite well, and I think that's competing pretty hard right now with the U.S. for shipments. So, we stand back and look at the markets. We're in mid-April. Planting and all that's ahead of us. We'll be watching weather closely and hoping usage holds up. And so far it has. Ethanol's been going pretty decently. Exports holding up well. And this nagging issue on the feed grain side of what higher fertilizer prices will do, if that'll end up and draw us back in terms of the amount of corn acres and corn production we had, corn and sorghum acreage and production that we'd have this year. So those are some of the things we'll be watching going forward.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, taking a few more minutes today to discuss the recent weather, and a big part of that being recently saw some severe weather here in Kansas.
Yeah, we did. I felt like we were in quite a bit of a lull, considering, we are in spring in Kansas. Tend to see an uptick in severe weather, and with the drier, warmer conditions, we hadn't really seen a whole lot of that. End of last week, we saw a return of that with some storms across central Kansas, northeast Kansas that provided some hail. We had some hail up to 2.5 inch diameter. We also had some strong winds as well, with gusts up to 60 miles an hour measured at several locations. And then I'll focus a little bit on that early part. That was last Thursday into Friday, even into Saturday. We had multiple rounds of storms that really focused in northeast Kansas, especially along southern Washington, northern Riley, southern Marshall County. And that area got hit by the first round of storms there on Thursday night. And then on Saturday morning, they had another round of storms, and each round provided about 5 inches of rain to that area. So they ended up with over 10 inches of rain in the course of about 2 days or so, and that led to a lot of flooding too. That's not a weather phenomenon we've talked much about this spring, because we just haven't had a lot of precipitation, but immense rains. In fact, the wettest April on record already for portions of that area, and it had a downstream effect too. All that water went straight into Tuttle Creek Reservoir, which is the reservoir just east of Manhattan. Not a huge deal, but when we think about things like water supply and water availability, spring is a time that we recharge our reservoirs for the remainder of the year, and we just haven't seen a lot of moisture, so we haven't seen a lot of recharge. And as we get later and later into spring, we start to get a little concerned about that. And so that definitely helped alleviate concerns for that area and for the Kansas River downstream that it flows into, but unfortunately did lead into flooding, and they were doing water rescues, and unfortunately a lot of road damage in that area as well. And as you move forward through the season and into summer, we got to keep in mind you can get these kind of heavy rain events anywhere in the state that can be extremely localized, and that's definitely what we saw with this event. And while there was drought improvements in that area, they were really rather short term. We get these kind of heavy rains; they tend to run off. They don't really soak into the ground very well. And that actually leads to kind of prolonged drought because, well, we have dry soils that don't want to absorb the water. And then the heavy rain comes, the water runs off, doesn't go in the soil, and we enter back into a dry period. So we dry the soils out again. Moving into early this week, we had a pretty impactful supercell or cluster of storms that developed just north and east of Wichita that went eastward into Kansas City. And that did produce several tornadoes, did a fair amount of damage, power outages, and some structural damage as well from those tornadoes, and also some big hail again. And these are just isolated circumstances. We really haven't had a widespread severe weather outbreak yet. We've had a couple opportunities for more widespread severe weather events. We just haven't optimized them, thankfully, which is good because we don't want the severe weather, but bad because we definitely need moisture. In fact, I live around the Manhattan area, and we got about 1.2 inches of rain over the course of about 3 or 4 days there over the weekend. And the soils are already as dry as they were before that rain because there's so much growing vegetation. We get further west, the vegetation is not growing as much just because they haven't had that first light rain event. Granted, we did see some light rain in southwest Kansas and the south central. However, it really wasn't a whole lot and enough to make a dent in the gap, and the drought continues to expand. With this week alone, we added D3 drought along the Nebraska border, and we've also expanded D2 drought. We're up to D2 or worse conditions, or up to 11% of the state. And while we did see some improvements in the Northeast that helped drop the overall drought coverage in the state down, where we do see drought persisting in central and western Kansas, we see drought worsening, and that's starting to show. I know there's a lot of impact on the wheat right now, where it's starting to just progress much ahead of normal for the time of year it should be in, and it's also progressing in very short. And so just a lot of concerns with wheat. And I even know there's some browning too in southwest Kansas. We need a lot of moisture for central and western Kansas to help kind of speed things up and maybe bring things back to a little bit normal and slow this drought down.
Are we seeing any precipitation in the forecast to hopefully slow down that drought?
Yeah, so got a chance of precipitation here on Friday afternoon with the cold front that's going to push through the state, develop a line of storms. That's, again, only really going to favor eastern Kansas with some severe weather components. Mostly strong winds is the biggest concern, but good moisture, hopefully, for eastern Kansas. It's kind of, while we're not spreading that moisture further west, we're at least building up moisture in eastern Kansas and south into Oklahoma and parts of Texas. And when we look at subsequent systems, we need moisture there to be able to get that Gulf moisture northward. So it is doing its positive despite not actually getting rainfall across the whole state. However, after that, we're going to go through the weekend dry. Temperatures will be cooler, especially on Saturday. We could have some potential for a frost, especially in the northern part of the state, maybe even a freeze in the far northwest. Not abnormal for this time of year. We're starting to approach our average first freeze dates in the state, and especially mostly in the southeastern part. But I don't expect any big impacts to that just because we haven't seen things green up as far north and west as where they could potentially see the freeze. But we're going to warm right back up on Sunday and be above normal temperatures through almost all next week. And the next chance of precipitation doesn't look to occur until maybe midweek next week, and we get this dry line type setup, which is what we've had all week, where basically western Kansas is really, really dry west of the dry line. Eastern Kansas is humid with a chance of storms, but just scattered storms. I think that pattern kind of sets up again by middle of next week and likely takes us through the next 7 days towards the end of the month. And it's a persistent pattern that's got a lot of potential. It's just we're not optimizing that potential, and I'm definitely concerned that we're not going to see widespread precipitation for potentially the rest of the month, maybe in portions of western Kansas.
And looking really long term with your expertise, Chip, are we going to hopefully then see moisture maybe in May if we're able to optimize that?
Yeah, with my expertise, it's hard to predict some of these impressive rains like we just saw here this over the course of the last week in northeast Kansas. It's a challenge this time of year. We got to remember the convective component, and thunderstorms are going to be hit and miss. I don't see any widespread big rain events. We look at the overall oscillations and the current conditions of the Pacific Ocean. We've now at least initially hit that neutral condition in the ENSO We've gotten rid of La Nina. Now, officially, we have to be in neutral conditions for 3 months to be official. But the water temperatures have greatly warmed up, and they're near normal right now. And that's in the process of that transition towards potentially El Nino and maybe even the super El Nino by the summer months. The problem is this fluctuation is good. It's good for Kansas. It typically means an influx of moisture once we swing to El Nino. It's just unfortunate that it's going to take a while for the atmosphere to reflect those conditions. And right now, we're seeing that transition start to occur in the atmosphere, but it's going to take months potentially for it to be realized. So I think we're going to see lingering La Nina impacts, especially for the drought-stricken portions of the state, continue into the summer. And I also see some potential for that maybe transition a little bit further east into some of these areas that are seeing the precipitation now. I think that precipitation might get a little bit more limited as we get into early summer. We could potentially see increasing dryness for eastern Kansas as well. And we start to get into that monsoonal activity for western Kansas come the middle of the summer. But again, probably just timely precipitation, probably a little too late for some crops. But I think the big change comes by the end of summer into early part of fall, where El Nino starts to really kick into gear. We start getting a lot more tropical activity in the Pacific, in the East Pacific. And those systems are going to transport moisture and push moisture north and east into the southwestern United States. It enhances that monsoon, but then we start seeing dramatic bleed over into the plains, and likely a wet fall is in the picture. I think a wet later summer potentially is for folks further west, the Colorado border, and definitely that going to have to adjust some plans, I think, to fully capture the optimism of that change. I'm hoping that it happens a little bit sooner than what we think is going to happen right now. But the potential's there and very high actually for that transition towards wetter conditions towards the end of summer and early part of fall, and maybe even continuing into winter.
These past few weeks, we've talked about fire weather. Are you seeing any of those concerns currently?
Yeah, we had a couple large fires in the state over the last week. Most of them were handled by local resources, didn't need any external help, which is good. It means I think people are being smart. They're being cognizant of their sparks, so we're not seeing as much fire activity. The Flint Hills have definitely greened up to the point where any fires that do escape, they're not going to go anywhere. They're just going to hit green grass. But until we get moisture in western Kansas and even portions of central Kansas, we're going to continue to see fire weather concerns, and the fuels are going to be conducive for fire spread.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing wild onions and wild garlic with K-State wheat specialist Sarah Ganske. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on today, Shelby.
Sarah, why are wild garlic and wild onion weeds that might be considered an issue for producers?
They're not necessarily super competitive, right? Usually when we're talking about weeds, I'm talking about pig weeds that are going to steal yield, right? Wild garlic and onions are not yield robbers, but they can reduce quality of our agricultural commodities. So specifically, I'm thinking about wheat crops or small grain crops. So, farmers who are used to growing wheat where we have wild garlic or wild onion know that the dockage for those when you take a load of grain to the elevator is pretty substantial based on the number of bulblets that you have in the sample of grain that gets pulled. The other way that these weeds can cause problems, Shelby, is if you're in a pasture situation. Shelby, I know you have goats. So if your goats were to get a hold of a big bunch of wild garlic and onions as part of their diet one day, you would smell that in the milk in the near future after that.
What do these look like out in the pasture?
So honestly, from a distance, they kind of look like grass. This time of year, you see them because they're growing faster than a lot of the grasses, right? Even our cool season grasses. So like just here in Manhattan, driving around town, they've been poking up in yards for the last month or so. But if you've ever gardened or if you've purchased green onions at the grocery store, right? You've got a pretty good idea of what these plants look like from a distance. They are monocots, so they have parallel veins, but they're not actually grasses. They're in the lily family.
You mentioned what they look like. Do they look pretty similar then?
Yes, the two species look very, very similar. So from a distance, they're going to look very, very much alike. If you get up close, though, if you cut the leaves in two, like make a cross section of the leaf, you will see that wild garlic has a hollow leaf, whereas wild onion has a solid leaf. That's one of the easiest ways to tell them apart is one is hollow and one is solid.
Do they ever get to having a flower sort of thing at the top?
So, sometimes they do. Some of your listeners, Shelby, might be familiar with some of the ornamental alliums, right? It's the same type of flower that you would see there, kind of a bunch, an umbel of flowers. They have a big variety in colors. Some of them are kind of greenish white. Some of them are really pink. The other thing you'll see at the top of those plants, Shelby, is little bulblets. So these plants don't produce a lot of seeds. They don't often reproduce by seeds, but they do form these aerial bulblets at the top of the stems. And so if you think about, again, back to the gardening example, if you've ever planted onions in the garden, onion sets, they're like little miniature versions of those that grow on top of the stems.
If they're not seen as very competitive, why is this something we're continuing to see?
So one of the reasons we see it in the situations we do, right, is because these are cool season plants. So they grow in the fall and in the spring. And so they're actively growing right now. They're also growing in our wheat fields, right? And so there's actually not a lot of herbicides to control them in wheat. Sometimes folks will list 2,4-D as one potential option rather for controlling wild garlic and wild onion, but the recommendation that I have heard the most is Harmony Extra. So like a low dose of 2,4-D or a low rate of 2,4-D with Harmony Extra is kind of one of the more recommended treatments for this in a wheat crop.
For the crop growers, what is an option besides chemical control for them?
So some would tell you that tillage might be an option, but you would have to do a lot of tillage pretty frequently in order to keep the bulbs from reestablishing, because what's more likely to happen with a single tillage event is it's going to get the bulbs and the leaves are going to get hooked on your tillage equipment and you're just going to spread them. But, with a lot of our weeds and wheat, we talk about the importance of crop rotation, right? If we can go to a summer crop and kind of, wear down the plants that are there, that could probably be a better non-chemical option.
That was K-State weed specialist Sarah Ganske. I will link an Agronomy e-update article on this topic. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.